The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stengel, just off the last point it was made, I noticed you sort of bounced up in your chair. Can you share what your thought was?
Sure. I think Mr. Andrews was confusing what happens during the life of a bank, what happens with any loan on a bank's balance sheet, and then what happens to the cover pool if the bank were to go into insolvency. And so certainly during the life of a covered bond program, non-performing loans are pulled out. They're kept on the bank's balance sheet so they can be worked out. One of the advantages is this is 100% skin in the game for banks. The resolution process that I was discussing was talking about what happens if the issuer were to enter into receivership, that pool then, instead of being liquidated, billions of dollars worth of loans liquidated at a single moment, is instead managed and collections brought in and its value maximized.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Stengel, actually walk me through a mechanic like what we've suffered through the last couple of years. You know, my real estate market goes to hell in a handbag. I have institutions in your community that are participants. What happens to the unwind?
I think what you'll see in that process, again, if an individual bank were to fail, so if banks aren't failing, banks are working with their borrowers directly. Again, we don't have loans that have been securitized. Banks are working with their borrowers directly to manage those defaults on the individual loans. Now, if a bank were to fail, so a bank that had issued covered bonds were to fail, the loans on its books in a normal receivership process, the bank would be put into receivership. The FDIC has to do something with that pool of loans on the bank's balance sheet. Normally, those are going to be sold. They're going to be sold to another institution. They're going to be liquidated in the market. Again, they're pledged as collateral for the benefit of bondholders. What this legislation does differently is instead of having to force a fire sale, a liquidation sale of those loans pledged as collateral, instead they're managed so that there's value realized not only by the bondholders, but also the residual ownership interest that's retained by the receivership for the benefit of other creditors.
All right.
Can I respond as well and give you the scenarios you're asking for?
Sure.
Okay, so you have this credit quality bond covered pool. During that meltdown, collateral values plummet across the nation. Loans go bad. So what they do by contract in that covered pool is they pull those bad loans out, they put in their good ones. When the receiver, the FDIC, comes in, they only have the poor assets. The investor doesn't get stung. It's the deposit insurance fund that gets stung and all the players that pay into that deposit insurance fund. And so what you've heard from the capital markets is the investors always hold.
Help me with one thing, because didn't a moment ago you walked me through that you would be doing that swap and then you'd be liquidating the non-performing asset?
That's just what I said. So earlier, when you have a pool which is pristine and it starts to go bad because the economy is tanked, that pool needs to be over-collateralized and remain pristine. So they swap out the non-performing asset and they put in a good one. Where does that non-performing asset go? It goes on the balance sheet of the bank, and they just start getting a pile upon pile of non-performing assets.
Well,
what do they do with that?
As you're liquidating those assets,
then they have to liquidate them, and they fire sale them. Or if it's so great, like a WAMU situation, the FDIC comes in and says, "What do we have here?" Well, we got a bunch of junk.
Mr. Chairman, and forgive me, but the other alternative is. Even more devastating. If you're in that market upheaval, at some point, then do you have the taxpayers step in? It also brings down the institution.
The taxpayers step in, and they have to potentially for those things. Who comes out a winner here is Wall Street and the investor. Everybody else.
And in many ways, forgive me for jumping in, but you also have the taxpayers being the loser in that scenario. And I know I'm running out of time. But one mechanic, okay, let's say the loans have been bundled and securitized. Walk me through the same scenario where.
If I could address that. The problem we see in the securitization market today is the tremendous complexity of trying to work out, modify mortgages. I mean, this is an issue before you all the time because there's so many different players involved in conflicting interests. The thing with the covered bond is that the bank that made the loan still has it. If it's in trouble, it moves out of the covered pool, but still on the bank's balance sheet, and then it is the bank without any other competing interests and conflicting interests, who then has to work with the loan. I would disagree with Mr. Andrews that these problem loans would be fire sailed off. The bank is going to treat it like any other loan that it has made on its books. It's going to try and work it out and minimize the loss. And I would suggest that in a covered bond environment where the bank still has 100% of the loan, it is going to be a much easier and straightforward process to resolve that problem than is the case when mortgages are securitized.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but I'd love someone to address what happens when the bank doesn't still retain 100% of the loan. And hopefully someone else in the panel will ask that.
There you go.
May I